know how many of these sessions, many sessions, and from the very beginning on CBAM, we had discussed CBAM prior to it becoming a fashionable thing and then becoming legislation in the EU. Quite an interesting topic. We started by kibitzing and if you are speculating as to what it may look like. We had the straw man at some point, analyzed what came out, and now there are a number of, that the legislation is over, there are a number of regulations that are coming out. And as you know, the detail is in the fine print in many cases. And I know this from the Paris Agreement, we're negotiating one thing in Paris, and now we're negotiating the fine print, which is turning a lot of things in a very different way. So CBAM has the probability of also having, maybe having also some strange outcomes, if you want, if we don't pay attention and we keep the spirit and we get it right, because CBAM has a very clear objective. We'll get into that in a moment, and I want to make sure that we on context what gets credited when somebody exports to the EU and they pay a carbon price. What gets credited in the CBAM is not a minor thing, and it's not a minor thing for the exporters/importers, and it's not a minor thing for the people that are in the business of observing this keenly, because they have something in the race, they have skin in the game. They want to make sure that the CBAM is applied properly and it does what it's supposed to do. It levels the playing field, and it kind of protects against the risk of carbon leakage. We have our team here that is the ERCST team. So it's Michael Melling, that you all know, and that I don't think needs introduction, but he's a senior fellow and at the ERCST, a board member of ERCST, deputy director of the center at MIT. Sarah Svensson, our colleague, that is keeping us on the straight and has been quite instrumental in making sure that we that this work gets done, and myself. But we have one missing in action, which is Aaron Cosby. He's not missing in action; he's missing on vacation. So he asked a key question a couple of days ago. He said, "Can you guys do without me?" Anyway, he said it by a long story about family and so on. So we said, yes, fine. So Aaron is not with us right now. We also, as we normally do, we start with the presentation from on the work that we've done on the report, and then there is a panel, and the panel is what we hope is a very interesting, balanced panel with Luca Tascini from University of Edinburgh Business School and Grantham Research at LSE, Susanne Ackerfeld from the Swedish Ministry of Finance, Amanda Luna from the Carbon Trust, and Canan Beninos Gençel. I'm not sure that I didn't massacre something here, Canan, and I apologize if I did, for the Turkish Cement Manufacturer Associated Çimento, which is Turkey is one of the countries that has a great amount of interest in how this thing is going to develop, because of the very important and intense trade relationship that it has to the EU, and the Turkish cement industry, an important component of that trade part. So I will now move on to the presentation. So I think that the way we agreed to do this, we start with Michael, and then we'll do a ballet between Michael and myself with the presentation, and then we'll revert to the panelists. Also, we have about 130, 140 people on the internet listening to this presentation. This is an open presentation. It is not on Chatham House rules, because it's a launch of an event. And once the presentation and the initial discussion within ourselves concludes, then of course, those that are on the internet, on the virtual Zoom conference call, we very much encourage them to raise their little electronic hand, and we will promote them to intervene, have questions, make comments. It is not easy usually, but we try to make sure that it is as interactive as possible. So, Michael, I pass it on to you now for the first few, and then we'll move on to myself and back to you then.
Perfect. Thank you, Andre. And it's great to be able to launch this report. It will be appearing online eventually. I think the report link will show up on the ERCST website, and what we'll be presenting is sort of the main takeaways. And then, of course, we as the authors, Sarah, myself, Andre, and Aaron, look forward to the feedback from our panelists and also from the attendees. It's a complex topic, and so we also had a lot of discussions, and initially we're vacillating on certain points and arguments, etc. So these kinds of exercises are extremely useful to kind of sharpen the views on these topics. So the starting point of today's discussion is that the CBAM regulation, we can go to the first slide, has this provision, Article 9, which clearly states that a certain kind of policy effort in trade partner countries, namely a carbon price effectively paid there, will be taken into account when a authorized declarant exports covered goods into the EU. In other words, if producers of these goods in the country of origin had to pay a price, a carbon price for the emissions that then are embedded in those goods, then that will be somehow considered. And so that, of course, is a big choice in itself, that there is any consideration of foreign climate policies, but in addition, it's a specific choice. It doesn't just say any kind of climate policy, it does narrow it down to carbon pricing. And so that's the starting point of this whole report and our discussions preceding the writing of the report and now today's presentation, that despite having what seems like a straightforward language in the regulation in Article 9, it does also give rise to a number of questions. The first sort of thoughts or exercise that we went through is sort of, why is this in there? No, I mean, you could essentially argue that if there was no crediting of foreign climate policy at all, then foreign producers, well, would pay a higher price because they don't get credit for something that they're paying domestically if they have a carbon price domestically in the country of origin. So this would actually even help prevent leakage from the EU to other countries. Emissions leakage, one could argue, would be even more effective as sort of a leakage prevention tool. But it seemed at the same time that that was not a convincing argument to say that not considering climate policies in the country of origin would help the purpose of the CBAM. Because the CBAM, as we understand it, is to level the playing field, to ensure that producers producing abroad, and typically given the sort of current EUA price versus carbon prices in the rest of the world, facing lower costs, of course, typically that's the situation, but at the same time, you wouldn't want them to pay the full CBAM certificate in addition to their domestic carbon price. They would actually then be paying more than European producers. So you would be sort of overshooting the target. It would not be a level playing field from fairness arguments, from a logical argument, but also from fairness arguments. It just didn't seem to make sense. Also, it would raise arguably risks under WTO law, because it would be really hard to justify not crediting the foreign carbon price, say under Article 20 of the GATT. How would you argue that this is done in order to prevent leakage? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, certainly for the economists, you would lose one of the most important incentives, because of course, having this provision in the CBAM regulation is what has kicked off in so many trade partners of the EU an accelerated process to explore carbon pricing and to begin implementing carbon pricing. And even, for instance, we have panelists here from Turkey, for instance, there's even been quotes from officials saying, well, the CBAM is one of the reasons that we're now really moving faster with carbon pricing. So clearly this has been, as Andre said, an important element of the CBAM regulation in terms of the incentives and also the responses in other countries. Let's go to the next slide. So that was the rationale. Why do we even have this provision in there? What are the objectives of that provision? And that was useful in order to think through that, was useful in order to understand and better what should and shouldn't be credited. Now, before going to what we interpret as being sort of the more eligible, the more likely types of carbon pricing to be credited and other policies to be credited, we also wanted to sort of step back a little bit and remind ourselves that the EU didn't only have this choice. One choice would have been not to have any provision on crediting of foreign climate policies. That, again, it would have seemed unfair. It wouldn't have sent an incentive. It may have been WTO risky, but it could have been a simpler option just to not credit at all. Given the choice to credit, for the reasons that we just listed, there would have been other ways to credit, not to narrow it down, for instance, to a carbon price effectively paid. It could also have been a choice to be a little bit broader and more agnostic, maybe, with regard to the policies that will be credited. Some US border carbon adjustments, for instance, have hinged on implicit carbon costs, so not just looking at an explicit carbon price from a tax or an emissions trading system, but trying to sort of calculate the average compliance costs under many different policies and consider that instead. Perhaps you even remember 10, 12 years ago that the US was on the verge of adopting a economy-wide climate policy, a climate legislation, the Waxman-Markey Act, which actually passed the House of Representatives. There, it contained a border carbon adjustment that would have completely exempted countries based on certain criteria, developing countries and or countries that have a certain level of climate ambition. So there are different ways to play this, whether and how to consider climate policies in trade partners, but the EU made a very specific choice. And we feel that this choice is, in many ways, a very compelling one because it's very straightforward. You only credit a carbon price. That's something that you can quantify and you can monetarily deduct from the certificate purchasing obligation in the EU. Of course, it has that further advantage that it mirrors in a way the policy that the CBAM adjusts for, namely the EU ETS. You're not crediting for things other than what the EU ETS is, namely a carbon price. So it has those advantages. At the same time, I think it's important to be aware that some countries do not have a carbon price and will never have a carbon price, including some very powerful, economically and strategically powerful allies like the United States, that is most likely not going to have a federal carbon price in the near future, that have expressed some disenchantment with this narrow focus on carbon pricing, saying that it's not really fair, that it's up to the US what they choose to implement, that other policies can be just as effective. And some developing countries might also argue, well, it's not only up to us to choose the right instruments for our circumstances, but we shouldn't even have a carbon price at the very same level as the EU to get a full credit, 100% credit, if you like, because of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So there are also arguments that one could use against this, and it'll be very interesting to see how this debate unfolds going forward. But going back to the earlier statement, the language of Article 9 is not 100% fully determined. There is scope for interpretation. And so that's what Andre will navigate us through, is this room. And such arguments, pro and con, may also inform what ultimately becomes the practice and also the guidance that the EU adopts on how to actually operationalize Article 9 of the CBAM regulation. And with that, I hand over to you, Andre.
Thank you, Michael. Look, one thing first and foremost, we had this discussion among ourselves, and should we have this chapter? Should we not have the chapter? The previous one. I want to make it clear we're not here to refight the old battles. How this is done. This is not productive. The EU has made its own decision. It's just the fact that things, as Michael has explained in Article 9, are not as clear as that would sound. What's an effective carbon price? I don't know what an effective carbon price is, but Michael's a lawyer, and I'm sure that he can have three interpretations. I may have my own interpretation. And the other thing that I would say is that we thought as part of our program, we write a number of papers, and this paper, we thought it was kind of not a no-brainer, but it was a paper that we would, wouldn't be so complicated. Well, let me tell you this is one, and it was one of the hardest fought paper among ourselves because we all were quite passionate, believing that we were right and looking at things in different ways. Now, it says recognizes effective price paid by imported product. I said, I don't know what the definition of effective is. But the one thing that I know is in general, and I try to apply that when we negotiate Article 6 and we did the rule book. What I always say is, listen, guys, when in doubt, legislation is always going to have constructive ambiguity. Whether it's international agreement or legislation, it's always there's a negotiation in the parliament and in the EU parliament, in the trilogue with the council and the commission. So there's always going to be hope for some if you want constructive ambiguity. So you need to find some principles to try and at least justify to yourself and justify to others as to why you go the way you go. And the one thing that we proposed a few tests. Interesting to see your reaction, because we think to some degree that this is at the heart of the discussion, at least the heart of the paper. Is there an explicit carbon price, a visible stated carbon price? We thought that would be a first test. And again, that this test are not yes, no, it's not fail on each and any one of them. I think that the way these tests are applied is also something that we need to understand, is that we, whether you pass the first test, then, you don't pass the first test, you don't look at anything else, or you pass the first test, but you can still fail something else. So is the carbon price explicit in a visible price? Why? Because, this is what the EU has done with the ETS, is the visible carbon price. It's something that also, frankly, has been repeated quite a lot in stakeholder consultation and discussion. We heard this from a lot of people in the EU power structure, you want to call it that way. It's a visible carbon price, a visible carbon price. Once in a while, you hear the explicit carbon price. So is that an explicit carbon price? Does it, a second thing is, does it contribute to the objective of the CBAM? Now, there's an earlier ERCST paper in which the objectives of CBAM, I wrote that particular chapter, there were about 6 identified possible objectives of CBAM. So it was, some people wanted to level the playing field. Some people wanted to, incentivize or force other countries to do a carbon price and have an equivalent carbon price. Some people wanted to get rid of free allocation. So this is like a Swiss Army knife. The CBAM in the end serve a lot of people, even though the stated official saying when the chips come down, it says to avoid carbon leakage. That is the official one. That's what you find in the legislation. So does it contribute to the objective? What do you mean by does it contribute to your objective? CBAM. Now, addressing carbon leakage, that is by ensuring that foreign producers pay equal amount as local producers for CO2. So you get the stuff to the border, and I paid 50 euros, and you paid 100 euros, and you paid 100 euros, so you guys owe me 50. So I mean, that's, that is one objective, is to ensure that there's a certain amount. That then is also promoting decarbonization and avoiding carbon leakage. Now, promoting decarbonization and carbon leakage, you can argue that you avoid that by ensuring that the price at the border is the same. But there's another element. There's a proposal from the Russian Federation. I remember maybe there's others who made that proposal, which says, listen, we're going to tax the stuff that comes out of the country. You want to put an export tax equal to EU, we're going to keep it. I think the Chinese were talking about the same thing. We're going to keep the money in the country. And why would I give it to the EU? Why not keep it here? I mean, it's kind of sound like a silly thing. I mean, give money to the EU when you can keep it in your own jurisdiction. So that is fine. But if you only apply it to the export part, then really the total burden that the producer has in terms of carbon cost will be lower than what the EU does. If you have €100 that is being paid only on exports, while the EU has €100 on the whole production, then you have the average cost of production of the unit, obviously, for the exporter is lower because it's only paying on the exports. So is this really prevent carbon leakage, or it provides an incentive to produce somewhere else? Also, does it, by lowering the cost of the burden cost of carbon on an exporter, does it not discourage decarbonization, or does not encourage as much decarbonization as if the carbon price was put on the whole production? So there is the issue whether you could credit, whether you should credit for export, or that it has to be applied, the cost has to be applied, or the price has to be applied for the whole production. That is the difference. And initially, we struggle with this. Should we really just consider what happened at the border, or should we consider what is the cost of production based on what the price is? So the question is, do you credit things that are not intrinsically applied to the whole production? And why are we saying this? We are saying this because the one thing that the EU will recognize and the EU knows is allowances. So allowances apply to the whole production. If you start crediting and allowing credit inside the country, then you intrinsically lower the cost burden on the whole production in that particular country. The next thing is, and maybe should have been the first one, is it consistent with the EU ETS? The CBAM is meant to be a companion to the EU ETS. The CBAM is meant to be replacing free allocation as a way of addressing the risk of carbon leakage. So we are dealing with instruments that are recognized by the EU ETS. So what does the EU ETS accept? The EU ETS accepts allowances. This is what we know. There are allowances issued by the regulator. We understand that. The EU ETS has a provision for domestic offset, had a provision for international credits used as offsets, but neither of these are currently triggered, and they were not by mistake. They were done on purpose as a hard and bloody debate. Some of you will remember that, and we have the scars of those fights whether international crediting should be allowed, and many people have militated for many years that domestic offset should be allowed in. But there's a second part of it, is if it's not an allowance that you recognize in an ETS, in a different country, do you recognize an EU ETS-like instrument? And what is an ETS-like? If we're looking at what is an allowance-like instrument, what are the characteristics of an allowance? So an allowance is something is very well defined. It comes out on a cap, and it's got a very clear MRV. If you start looking at credits, international credits or domestic credits produced into a country, then all of a sudden you're dealing with a lot of other things in terms of the quality of the ton, but you're also dealing not only with the quality of the ton, but you're also dealing with issues such as additionality. So it is a EU ETS. It is an allowance-like instrument, a credit, an international credit from a baseline and credit. Is it an international? Is it an ETS-like instrument, an allowance-like instrument? The answer is probably there are differences. The second one, though, if you look at something like a tax, the tax, grosso modo, is generally, if you listen to the noise in the conversation, a tax, it generally seems to be accepted that will be credited, or at least that's the general noise. I don't think there's, I don't have a certainty, Why? I mean, can you justify it based on kind of the what is being said here? Is it is that it has something close to an allowance? One could argue that is a clearer cut. There's not this MRV dispute. There's not this additionality dispute. It doesn't come under a cap and increases the cap. So you could argue that in the case of the CBAM, a tax may play a role of the ETS-like instrument. I want to make it clear from an ERCST point of view that we are not in any way, shape, or form criticizing the use of credits from a baseline and credit or the international credits in an ETS. That is absolutely not. The question is, in a CBAM-like situation, when the EU is not using them, does it make sense to use it? That is the debate that we're having. Next, please. Now, where do the explicit carbon prices come from? They come from compliant instruments. Maybe this slide should have come in first. They come from a compliance system. So for an emission trading system, it's an absolute emission trading system. Could it be also intensity-based system? Could it be that? That's something to be discussed. Or a taxation on all domestic production, on all your exports. So this is where an explicit carbon price can come in the compliance instrument. It can come from voluntary systems, and voluntary system, you can have credit certification systems such as there are gold standards. So you do have a market for that by using these, for instance, in compliance instruments, or you can have a market for compliant or for international for voluntary system for voluntary commitments such as BTIs that may allow for the use of third-party certification system, or that may have their own credit certification system that can be used to meet this international voluntary commitment. Next, please. Now, domestic credits, the credits will be, at least we try to categorize them, and some people argue strenuously. I hope this doesn't detract and doesn't get us into discussion about what is the exact repartition and how do you exactly categorize them. But the way I categorize them, or we had agreed, or the three of us to categorize them, is that there's domestic credits, and the domestic credits are those credits as such in the ETS, where you could have things that are being accepted by the ETS, but are produced inside the EU under regulation produced by the regulatory system that set up the emission trading system. I said the EU has a provision for that. That provision has never been triggered and has never been triggered conscientiously. What are the considerations? The consideration is that, first of all, the EU doesn't have in domestic credits. So you could say, well, the EU doesn't have domestic credit. You want to mirror, you have an ETS in China or in some other country. If they have domestic credits, tough luck. We're not recognizing them because we don't recognize them. The other thing is that the overall, we discussed this, the overall burden that domestic and foreign producers face in meeting obligation by using offset, you lower the overall cost, the overall burden on the whole production, which then I would say would counter somewhat the effort of decarbonization, but also increase the risk of carbon leakage because the cost of production is lower overall. Next, please. So these are domestic credits. International credit, based on the experience that we have, is credits that are produced in other jurisdictions based on, it could be on a protocol that is being decided by the importing system, like it could be that the EU ETS decided to recognize CBAM in a period, or it could be recognized Article 6.4, whatever it is, or it could recognize, or they could recognize the Japanese system. It represents an official and a visible and effective price and cost that the export has incurred. The fact of the matter is that there is the EU ETS also does not allow international credit. It did, and it stopped doing so. I think that the door right now of using international credits officially in the regulation is totally closed. But my sense, especially in certain categories such as removals, may become more open in the future. You could argue that there is a category of credits, you could argue, and we'll get into that, that currently exists in the EU, and that comes from carbon storage, CCS, because that's a rebate, and one could argue that is a domestic kind of offset, that credit that's used as an offset. Next, please. So there is then the voluntary offsetting. So that whether the importers, regardless of whether importers pay a voluntary or compliance system, they will have the same cost. And CBAM will not. The CBAM will not consider regulatory offsets, something produced by regulation in a different country. The probability, and I want to say this clear, the probability of accepting crediting from something which is a voluntary system, in our view, is less so. This may run contrary from the experience of ICAO, where ICAO is part of ICAO, and it is recognizing such system. You know, there are considerations such as the certainty that exists, the certainty we would perceive it from a EU standpoint, a EU regulator looking at a whole gamut of voluntary credits. You're not talking necessarily about gold standard, let's say, we're not on Vera, but there's another 150 other ones. The fact that once you accept one, then you're gonna have to have a heck of a time justifying why you're not accepting, or at least examining others. And examining each of them and monitoring the application of each of them can become somewhat nightmarish, again, because there is a whole bunch of diversity in there. Next, please. Michael, I think this is where we pass it on to you.
We hand over again, exactly. A complicated ballet move, but no problem for us. So thanks, Andre. And now two last slides on sort of additional borderline cases, if you like. Before we then wrap up with conclusions. One borderline case Andre already mentioned, and that is, what if a country decides not to introduce carbon pricing across all producers of a certain good, like cement, but really only taxes, for instance, the shipments of cement that leave to the EU in order to capture the tax rent, if you like, the revenue. And there had been some mention, as Andre already indicated, a year or two ago during the sort of consultation process, some headline, I think indeed it was Russia saying, well, we're just going to have an export tax. And then there was a reaction from somebody in the commission saying, wait, that's not what we meant. The thing is, the language, as with these other cases that Andre already discussed, the language of Article 9 does not expressly exclude that. It doesn't say that it has to be a sector or national, economy-wide carbon price. It really just says an effectively paid carbon price on the goods, on embedded carbon in the good entering the EU. So you couldn't rule it out purely on the language of the provision in Article 9 in the CBAM regulation. However, we again feel that this would undermine some of the objectives and the rationale of crediting under the CBAM, because it would mean that the majority of production would not face a carbon cost, and only that small share that goes to the EU, you're not really leveling the carbon price at the carbon costs, if you like. You're not leveling the playing field if you're allowed only to credit exports, very similar to, for instance, the rationale with the offset credits that Andre mentioned previously. The next thing is something that we've already observed, the effect that having a crediting mechanism for carbon pricing seems to have prompted some jurisdictions around the world to reconsider the label applied to some existing mineral oil and fossil fuel excise taxes. Rumors at least have it, I think nobody in the audience is from Uruguay, that the highest carbon tax in the world, according to State and Trends of Carbon Pricing, the Uruguayan carbon tax is actually nothing more than what they previously had as a mineral oil tax, but now they've called it a carbon tax and slightly changed the way that it is calculated to be linked to, in fact, not energy content or volume, but the carbon content, but ultimately doesn't make a huge difference. So does that mean that technically maybe countries could say, well, we have these energy taxes, they should be credited? We feel without some changes like Uruguay did to really make it a carbon tax, probably not. It simply lacks that character of being linked to the carbon content. Also, do not forget that European producers are also subject to excise taxes for energy, and they're not being adjusted through the CBAM. So the CBAM does not require foreign producers to then also essentially pay for the carbon or level the carbon costs that European producers face under mineral oil and energy taxes. So that would be another sort of asymmetry, if you like. And it could become quite difficult to administer and arbitrary. Some countries have already relabeled it, others haven't. How would one sort of manage that? So it could become still a bit complicated, depending on how this really starts shaping, if you like, the nomenclature of energy and carbon taxes around the world. But on the plus side, it may actually create sort of a movement towards having more carbon pricing by looking at all the pricing that's in place, including on energy, and thinking about, can we turn that into a climate policy instrument? So there could also be benefits, but at least our sense is probably not unless it becomes a real and genuine carbon price. Let's go to the next slide. Climate-related regulations that are not pricing. So say performance standards, but not tradable, just as, or technology standards, phase-out mandates, all kinds of policies that do not reveal or state an explicit carbon price. This is something that the US has been grappling with because it doesn't have a federal carbon price. So there's been this idea of sort of calculating the average compliance costs and calling it the environmental costs incurred and using that as the basis for a border carbon adjustment. So one could theoretically do that, but clearly in the EU, there is an explicit carbon price and the CBAM is accompanying that. It accompanies the EU ETS. So it would not make sense to expand the universe of what is being adjusted for and credited to all these other policies. It's a whole different ballgame. So we don't think there's a high probability that implicit carbon prices for the cost of complying with other policies will count. Now, there are some complications with carbon prices paid on input goods, because again, the Article 9 wording does not say anything about that. But of course, the CBAM does consider emissions in precursors, and it's relatively complex to sort of parse that out even at the emissions monitoring, reporting, and verification stage. So how about carbon prices paid on precursors, input goods that are used in processing goods that are covered by the CBAM? And one would have to ask questions such as, where would it, for instance, be considered? What if the precursor comes from a different country than the good that's then actually made out of, say, steel, nuts, bolts, fasteners? Would one then consider the carbon price in the country of origin of the precursor and the carbon price in the country that processes it into the fasteners? So this could become a bit complicated. Clearly, there needs to be more guidance on that. And finally, there is this interesting case of performance standards, which would not per se be a pricing instrument like a tax or an emissions trading system, but there have been debates that, well, if you turn a performance standard into a tradable performance standard, essentially a baseline and crediting system, where anybody who is performs better than a benchmark, gets credit and can sell that to those who don't perform as good as the benchmark, so they have a shortfall, and you start getting trading, and that of course reveals a price in the market based on supply and demand. One could think about that, but there is still a fundamental difference to the carbon price of the EU ETS, which the CBAM adjusts for, namely that under the EU ETS, everybody pays for every ton of residual emissions. In such a performance standard, you only pay for the shortfall to the benchmark, and you only get credit for how you exceed the benchmark, but you don't pay for everything else, for all the residual emissions. So again, this is really a borderline case where we didn't have a strong sense and feel sort of that it's probably not going to be counted. In practice, it doesn't matter too much because there's very few jurisdictions that are using this kind of approach, but it could become more widespread going forward. Now, let's look at one third issue that we found, sort of a separate one, not a conceptual one, but more a real world, and we can go to the next slide, more a real world implementation or practice argument, namely that no carbon pricing system, including and especially carbon taxes or emissions trading systems, so the ones that we feel are clearest in their eligibility to be credited, are ever perfectly implemented. Even the EU ETS has had instances of non-compliance, of fraud in the market, etc. Theoretically, at least, the need under Article 9, paragraph 2 of the CBAM regulation to document exactly the payment of a carbon price and to have an independent or third-party entity certify that, hopefully would take care of such cases of, say, fraud or non-compliance or things that aren't the way they should be in the books. But the reality is that some countries are, especially if you think of countries with a high share of state-owned enterprises and very active use of industrial policy, of subsidies and supports, you could imagine a country saying, well, okay, we'll have a strong carbon price, and at the same time, and totally separately, and no connection whatsoever, silently, unspoken, there will be some sort of support, some kind of subsidy that will be pretty much exactly what they have to, the payment obligation under the CBAM to kind of make up for that, so that they remain competitive, that they remain keeping their competitive advantage, their artificial, you could say, competitive advantage due to the climate policy costs. So it's hard to sort of rule that out. Hopefully Article 9, paragraph 2 would avoid most of those things, but it still probably will need careful monitoring of how countries do implement their carbon pricing and how robust the real world implementation will be. And these kinds of differences and let's say real world sort of implementation issues could also affect the debate about what should and shouldn't be credited if there are cases and examples that not so robust carbon prices that look good on paper, but in practice aren't really implemented well, are being credited. One can never predict exactly what the arguments will be. So conclusions to wrap up this presentation. As we've said, Article 9 does allow for crediting, but it at the same time makes very clear that it's narrowly limited to carbon pricing. Still, there are many areas of uncertainty and borderline cases. That was the bulk of our analysis and presentation. Clearly, there needs to be further guidance, and there is a mandate in Article 9 for the Commission to adopt an implementing act that would provide further operational guidance on how to implement Article 9. And this has to come sooner rather than later, because already, as we can even see here in the Q&A, this is an important issue, really important issue for trade partners and foreign producers. So questions are already being posed with a lot of urgency, not least because many of these trade partner countries are in the process of implementing carbon pricing and want to know whether or not what they're doing will help their domestic companies comply with or reduce the burden from the CBAM. We argued that there can be tests and criteria to sort of help predict what will and will not be eligible for crediting. And one of the most important ones is, of course, that it not undermine the objectives of the CBAM. And another one is that it be consistent or sort of mirror what the EU ETS allows, especially when it comes to tradable units, such as offset credits or voluntary carbon market units, which would be inconsistent with the current EU ETS architecture. We feel that overall this price suggests that application of Article 9 will be somewhat narrow, despite the fact that the language is relatively open and could allow things like export crediting or offset credits. Just from the language, we feel like the legislative history, the comments that we've heard so far, and our criteria suggest it'll probably be somewhat more narrowly applied. But of course, that's only a prediction, not, really, there's no guarantee. I mean, only when the practice starts unfolding and when the guidance has been published will we have more reliable indication. And finally, again, it's also clear that there will continue to be debate, no matter how this proceeds going forward. Some countries will not be happy with it, others might be happy with it. And so the EU will have to explain and defend this approach in the sort of ongoing continuous international debate about these trade-related climate measures, which of course is a controversial topic to begin with. With that, wrapping up the presentation. Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah, can you just, stop.
Maybe we've lost Andre again, I'm not sure. But anyhow, the next step is an easy and pleasant one for us, the presenters of the paper, namely that is now to sort of get reactions from our excellent panelists. And Andre has already introduced them before. but let's see, I think he is out. So I would say I'll proceed. Okay, Susanne, you're alphabetically first, if I'm not mistaken, and you're also under somewhat difficult circumstances right now. Geographically, you're in Jakarta, outside of an airport. So all the more heroic that you decided to join us as somebody who's followed the carbon pricing debate for a long time, and now especially also the CBAM debate. And Andre, you're back. So if you want to add something.
I don't know. I'm sorry. It looks again. I think Suzanne, you have a better luck than I have tonight. No, what I was trying to say, is the fact that at this point we keep it saying, and we cannot tell you for sure what's going to happen, and why this is important is because this is coming down, and you cannot hedge into this business. There is no hedging. There is no market for CBAM certificates. So people will hedge invariably in other markets. They will likely hedge in the EUA market, and by the way, ERCST has a session on hedging for CBAM and the implication for the ETS market in about 2-3 weeks from now with Redshaw. But at the same time, I think that it also, as a think tank, and we have a certain professional pride between the four of us, is we want to say something and what is right and what is wrong, and it is quite clear, I think, from at least the criteria that we put together. What I tried to explain, what Michael explained so eloquently, is that it sounds like a no-brainer that something that is in the EU ETS allowances would be credited. That sounds like a bit of a no-brainer almost. But then the probabilities, there are different levels of probabilities. Crediting international credits or domestic credits is one side. Then you have taxes. Then you have credits from voluntary systems. Then you have a number of other things that Michael has spoken about. So how the pressure is going to be and where this is going to land, I think we better find sooner rather than later, as Mike has quite well put it, because time is not on our side and people are anxious. We'll start the panel in the order that we have. Luca, you go first, then Susanne, and then down the panel. So Luca first.
Okay, thanks a lot. Susanne, sorry, I'm probably just interjecting here. Pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Just checking everyone can hear me. All right, good. Pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for inviting me to read the report. Very timely, a lot of thought-provoking aspects. And I would like to add one or two thoughts, or actually just share one or two thoughts on the implementation of a European version of a border carbon adjustment, by examining or discussing together with you just a couple of key design considerations that are related to determining adjustments and crediting. First and foremost, as Andre was mentioning, I think it's essential to recognize that policymakers may have diverse objectives when implementing a border carbon adjustment in general. Among all these objectives, you can have a primary focus on try to prevent carbon leakage, preserving industrial competitiveness, encouraging other nations to adopt greenhouse gases and similar reduction policies. My assumption here is that one of the key one of the key objectives is addressing carbon leakage in the context of European CBAM. And in that particular case, the ultimate aim of the European CBAM is to ensure that foreign producer pay a price per ton of emission that is equivalent to what a similar position EU producer would pay. Emphasis on the equivalency here. So to do that, it's crucial to account for climate action within trade measure. That's exactly the point of the paper. And that's exactly as Andre was asking, what should they counted? So which policies? And the European Commission decided to go for domestic policies that offer like treatment of domestic and imported products, and that are price-based climate policy. So like in the paper, like in your report, Michael and Andre, I like a lot the point that you're making about, you could also consider non-price-based policies, but any effort to incorporate non-price policies will obviously pose substantial conceptual and methodological challenges. And I completely agree with the statements that you're making in the report. In particular, the fact that the Article 9 at the moment, as it is designed, offers a reasonably transparent crediting methodology for a direct comparison of the policies. However, and again, Andre, you mentioned that devil is in the detail. The chosen crediting approach, I think it has its own set limits. And I would like to make these not necessarily discussing at this stage voluntary, whether you can credit and recognize voluntary or international credits, or even the borderline cases. But I would like actually to consider one of the cases you do in the one of the spatial example, if you like, that you make in the report. So let's, and why I want to do that, because I would like to re-emphasize that Article 9 stipulates that an adjustment in the CBAM certificates can only be claimed if a price has been effectively paid. And that is this effectiveness that I think is very interesting to discuss. And I believe that this crucially depends on the design choices that have been taken by whatever regulatory agency in the exporting country. So let's take the example that you make in the report, that is two different jurisdictions having an exactly identical carbon price level. And this does not necessarily reflect the same level of cost exposure, right? So having the same price is not necessarily meaning having the same cost. That requires to take into account factors like exemption, or in the case of a cap and trade system, free allocations. And that I think can potentially reduce quite significantly the effective price that is paid by an importer. And I think this really necessitates a good thinking. Let's take again a thought experiment, perhaps more than a thought experiment, a real experiment. You have Europe and you have UK, and now UK outside Europe implementing an equivalent, practically an equivalent system in terms of on paper, but differential prices. So in this particular case, you might think that this is the perfect case of CBAM applies, right? European system, UK system design as a copycat on the European system. So they should be de facto considered to be equivalent. Any sort of price differential is exactly the price that should be paid, including net of any sort of other adjustment. Is that the case? Do we need to take into account other potential differences in adjustment? In wherever you have now a situation where the prices are exactly equivalent, now how or equal, how exactly can we quantify this effectively paid cost? I think this really requires quite a lot of thinking. Not only that, it will require also quite a lot of information coming from the exported companies about the quantity of embedded emissions that are covered by the regulation in any sort of form of rebate and compensation. So I would really welcome your thoughts about this and how we can, at least in the situation where we have similar system, how we can put more qualifications around the term effectively paid. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I will come back to your question. Susanne, I don't want to tempt the devil. I mean, you've been sitting on that network that looks more stable than what I have, but I don't want to, please go ahead.
No, thank you, Andre, I hope you hear me well. You hear me well?
Yeah, yes, we hear you well.
Yeah, and also I need to leave sort of in half an hour because I need to do check-in so I actually catch my flight. And to answer Michael, I'm in the airport. I'm not outside. Then I would have died of the heat here. So I mean, I'm actually in the airport in Jakarta. Okay, thanks very much for this very interesting report, and I very much agree with quite a few of the comments made already by Michael and Andre, and I will, and also with some of the things that Luca said. So I will not bore you with repeating these things, but I can just underline the need that the CBAM is supposed to mirror the ETS. So that's why we are saying we are taking account of pricing, carbon pricing, because we don't take account of regulations, other things. So I mean that's the first thing, and also it's of course the whole point of this is to ensure that there is a level playing field, so to say, of the price between products produced in the EU and outside the EU, which of course is basic and everyone know it. Then I'd like to make some comments which are more from, as I'm a lawyer, you know, I need to take, and I know that Michael also is, but I need to start with a little legal warning here. I mean, when we are doing the implementing act, when the Commission will eventually propose an implementing act, which will be sent out for public consultation. So I very much welcome that all stakeholders give their views, and also that it will be discussed in the CBAM committee where member states are represented. I'm the head of the Swedish delegation. Then you cannot, in the implementing act, go any further than the regulation. What the regulation says, what the co-legislator has decided, the wording, they can be interpreted in different ways, but you cannot go beyond what is said there. And that is important because we have now talking about Article 9, but Article 9, you need to read it in connection with Article 329, because there is the definition of carbon price. There it actually says what is a carbon price, and you have certain criteria that you need to look through and to fulfill. And also, and I will touch upon that a bit later. And also, it might be worth mentioning the possibility that is in Article 212 of that the Commission can, the EU can have bilateral agreements with countries, you know, to acknowledge certain carbon pricing schemes in certain countries. The intention when that article was implemented was more to simplify procedures. If it was very clear that a country had a very system that was robust and things, that they wouldn't have to do it every details, but that has to be seen. What will be done about it? I have heard rumors when I was here in Jakarta that there are China and India are thinking of wanting to make use of this at a high political level. This Article 212. I thought it was more in the future, but who knows? I mean, this is a global question. It's very interesting. So we have the legislation, and we have to look within the legislation. Even if we like something else to happen, we cannot forego the legislation. That is the boundaries that's really on. And also one thing that we should not forget when you talk about this is that we acknowledge that third countries have their own right to choose their policies. It's under the Paris Agreement. They can choose whatever, they have the national right to decide what policies they want. So whatever policies they use, whether it's a regulatory measure, an excise duty, or whatever, if it reduces the use of fossil fuels and their emissions, then it means less CBAM. So that it receives the same result, because a carbon tax, then you're not doing if you pay a carbon tax or similar carbon pricing system, you really don't reduce your emissions. You just pay for it, and that's a different thing. So I think you should remember that there are two different columns. So I'll see what I more noted here. Yeah, the voluntary carbon offsets, that's something that's becoming increasingly popular, I would say. I mean, particularly in Asia, also in other countries. And there, I think you need to distinguish, which also is done in the paper, about two kinds of voluntary, or maybe three kinds of voluntary agreements. First of all, the voluntary agreements that doesn't have any link to the reduction of the carbon emissions that are part of the embedded in the goods. Something else, investments in a solar cell production somewhere or something, that they should not be taken into account, because they are not really linked to the reduction of greenhouse gases. But then we have some countries that are already allowing, like South American countries, for example, South Africa, that are letting they have a carbon tax in place, and then they let the taxpayer can actually fulfill his carbon tax obligation by surrendering CBAM certificates, these voluntary certificates. And there it's where you get in a little gray zone. At least you need to think about it a bit. So because there you have a price, the effective price for that is levied, and the carbon offset is simply a way of fulfilling that criteria. That's something that needs to be looked into. I'm not saying that it should be done, but it's something that maybe looked into. And yeah, that's it. And of course, with the voluntary credits, like it's written in the report, there are a lot of this far problems with those. I mean, to certify and are they really? Can you really trust them, so to say? So that will hope that I'm sure that will develop over the year. In Indonesia, just Friday, introduced a new exchange where they will sell this kind of voluntary agreement. Exports, yeah, that sounds like an innovative approach. Obviously, I would to add to what Michael and Andrew was saying, I would also say WTO, very problematic in WTO terms. I would say we could discuss that later at some other time. And then, of course, it's correct, like they said in the report, that the EU producers also fails a lot of other regulations and excise taxes and so on. So, I mean, if we should mirror these systems, we should take account of those as well. But there are, of course, borderline cases that needs to be looked into. But basically, I think the CBAM regulation, and that is not because I was part of drafting it, but it is a good starting point, and there are certain details, of course, which needs to be carved out in the implementing regulation. But you need to read, as I said, the definition of carbon price in Article 3 in connection with Article 9, and also read, like Michael, I think, was pointing out, Article 9.2, where it says what information are the CBAM declarant supposed to hand over. And this talks about reference to relevant legislation in the country, which means that there should be some kind of a regulatory measure, not something totally voluntary, something. So I think I'll leave it there, and we're happy to listen to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne, and indeed taking us back to some of the provisions that are in the regulation. That always innovative way and rewriting the regulation, but nevertheless the legislation is there and should be the guide as to the largest extent possible in choosing what will be counted, what will be credited. Amanda, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Andre, and thank you also, Michael and Sarah, for inviting me to participate in this event. And as a panelist, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. So I'll speak from the perspective of the developing countries, especially Latin America. I'm based in Mexico, and most of the work I do, I work with developing countries that are trying to implement a carbon price, or in the process of implementing a carbon price. So one of the first things that caught my attention from while I was reading the report was that in the end, one of the key conclusions is that there is a lot of complexity for actually implementing the CBAM, how this is going to work. And this is usually the case for any international treaty, because you try to make something that looks good and that seems like operable, but once you get to the detail, to these borderline cases, and you start analyzing on a case by case, it becomes quite complex. So just one of the first things that I wanted to highlight is the importance of that. The credits that are going to be eligible need to mirror what the EU ETS does. And here is where we are going to face the key differences in developing countries. So in Latin America, only Mexico, for instance, has an emissions trading system in operation or about to be fully operational. Other countries have implemented carbon taxes. And at the same time, we are also seeing a lot of subnational policies. So one of the things that I started to wonder while I was reading the report is how and if subnational level policies are going to be taken into account. Because in Mexico at the national level, we're starting to try to understand how to account for this. Then a second point, and I think it was also a question that was raised in the chat, is about carbon accounting, because the CBAM regulation talks about embedded emissions per product. So I think also having a thought about how these the methodologies or how these greenhouse gas emissions are going to be accounted for is also key. And then the other point that I also wanted to comment on, and that it was mentioned in the presentation and it's mentioned throughout the report, is the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities, and how the CBAM aims to promote decarbonization, or could promote decarbonization in these third parties. But at the same time, there's like a limit in which it like goes beyond what each party should be doing. So like establishing the NDC is a responsibility of each party, and there's no like space for the EU to have an intervention there. And yeah, I think yeah, and I also wanted to mention what we are seeing from the Carbon Trust on how corporates, especially in Latin America, are looking at CBAM and what is going to happen with the discussion from the other side of the room, let's say. So first thing that I wanted to mention is that when you look at climate risks, carbon price is one of the main transition risks that is coming out on TCFD analyses or the climate disclosures that corporates that we work with are starting to do. And I thought that was also a relevant thing to mention. So I'll stop here, and yeah, thank you again for having me in this panel.
Thank you, Amanda. Listen, this is, Latin America is quite dynamic, and they're introducing a variety of instruments. Obviously, people would like to make sure that they also get credit for, it's not the only reason they do it, but it's certainly not an unimportant reason. Chanan, I think you represent a whole bunch of members of your organization, which are quite preoccupied and probably may call you afterwards and say, so do you know the answer now? So please go ahead. We have to tell you that both Michael and I will be, and Aaron will be in Ankara also on a project related to climate and trade in the second half of October. So we hope to see you there in person. Chanan, please.
Very nice. Thank you very much. And I also would like to thank you for your invitation. And I would be very happy to see you in Ankara. I am also based in Ankara. And as you know, our association, we are an association and we represent the whole sector, nearly 95% of the production. And we are a bridge between the producers and the stakeholders. And related to CBAM, we are following the procedure and everything from the beginning, and we are informing our members from top to bottom who are related to the issue, but still there are many people who has to learn what happens. And thank you very much for sharing this valuable report. It is a very good opportunity for me to review it, and I think there are many things that you mentioned are likely to happen. First of all, I think that there are many issues to be clarified, as you mentioned many times, the effective carbon price. And I really wonder, this independent person, he or she is a Superman. He will confirm all carbon pricing and take all the responsibility. I think there will be penalties for this person. And I think it will be discussed in the near future. And the verification of all these reductions you mentioned. There are many possibilities, and I didn't even think many of those opportunities for carbon pricing. And in Turkey, maybe we should work more detail on the other mechanisms. And also, as you mentioned, I believe that the EU will be very conservative in defining the eligible credits. I believe that they will take it from mandatory carbon tax or compliance system. And after reviewing the report, I made a sectoral review for myself what an emerging country, not for Turkey. Turkey is a developing country like Mexico, and they have nearly the same indicators. What should an emerging country do if it doesn't have a, if she, let's say, doesn't have a emission trading system? To me, first of all, an emerging country should really focus on Article 9, clarification of the issues in Article 9 and reduction of the cost. But most countries, like also it's the same in Turkey, don't prefer this and try to make the carbon border adjustment at the, put the carbon border adjustment at the heart of the domestic ETS discussions. The only reason for establishing a domestic emission trading system is the CBAM. This is the scene, but this should not be the scene. A country, an emerging country, should establish an emission trading system as per its targets that they gave to the UNFCCC, the NDCs, and their common but differentiated responsibilities. And of course, it is not that it becomes not Article 9, but it becomes Article 2.6. It becomes exemption. It seems nice if the export of the country has a big share. Export to the EU has a big share, and 100 euros is a good price. It will be kept in the country. But I think all the stakeholders, government and NGOs and everybody should take 2 points into consideration. You also mentioned them in your report. One is the equity. Really, the country should look at its NDC and ambitions, because the ambitions of the European Union is not the same as the emerging countries, because for a full exemption, you should fully link to EU ETS, and that there's one reality that the European Union commits 55% reduction from 1999 levels. They have an absolute cap. Everybody should consider this. And the second point is economy. Of course, I will give an example from the cement sector, but this calculation is the same for every average emitting cement plant in the world. Considering a 100 euro per ton of carbon dioxide price, and nearly as the free allowances decrease step by step, the carbon price will increase step by step, and it will maybe go up to 15 to 80 euros in 10 years. And in most countries, it will affect domestic prices in upward direction. And this will be the same in all domestic markets and all emerging countries. And this calculation is for only cement. So all the sectors in an emerging country should make all these cost calculations for designing ETS. And in the end, CBAM is a reality. This is in force, and this will be widespread. This is very important, and all countries should take into account this. But Article 9 should be the basis instead of full exemption in all these discussions, and the authorities should also always work for these opportunities of Article 9. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Canan. Michael, Aaron is not here, so Michael and Sarah, I think two things that maybe I detect right now that we should have maybe had a further discussion, and it'd be interesting, is one of them is the issue that was raised out of subnational. You know, how, is this going to be made a difference, whether it is a national system or a subnational system? I mean, whether, it's something to be interesting. In the end, the interlocutor is a national government, but in some cases you have very credible and very widespread. In the US, for example, you begin to have a whole network of subnational to emerge, and not only in the US. The second thing is, which is going to be the devil's advocate now, you end up in a discussion whether you credit, whether 100, you pay 100 in Europe, but 20 paid in India. How much is that worth in EU terms? Is that the same amount, or you create a cocktail of some sort of GDP per capita, emissions per capita, emissions per whatever, and then you balance that and you rationalize that in some way. Is that necessary or not? I mean, that you could make the case for that if you really want to be complete. So maybe interesting to hear whether I had nothing to do with wondering about my internet, and these are not good ideas. Anyone else? Does any of you want to comment on any of the other ones? I think Susanna is probably gone to the check-in counter. But Luca, maybe, I don't know, did you want to react to anything, or Michael, do you want to react to something? And then, Susanna is still here. And then I would like to invite those that are as part of the virtual audience, as part of this webinar, to raise their electronic hand, and then I will promote them right away to be speakers. So first Luca and then Susanna. Let's go Susanna first.
Maybe go Susanna, exactly. Go Susanna, please.
Okay. I just had a quick comment. A quick comment on the subnational taxes, because I don't see a problem there. I mean, it doesn't say in Article 9 that it should be a national federal legislation. I mean, it has to be legislation, it has to be effectively paid, but whether it's subnational or not, I don't see, because, for example, Mexico or Canada, for example, has both the federal backstop, but also has like British Columbia has a subnational tax. So I don't see there is a problem there. And as for the voluntary markets, I see they are very complicated. But I think I need to go now, and I sign off and wish you best of luck with your continued discussions, and meet up some other time and continue these important discussions. And to answer the question, one question in the chat, when will the implementing act come? I think it definitely has to come well in advance of 2026, but the Commission, of course, has to first present a proposal, then send it out for consultation, go it through the CBAM committee. So it's not tomorrow, but hopefully, I hope the Commission will work quite fast, because I understand that this is important for third country producers, definitely. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Safe travels.
Thank you, Susanna. Luca?
Just to make a follow-up comment from Jinan, point about starting from the full exemption, perhaps would be useful again in the report to work out under which condition, moving away from a full exemption, you can actually start seeing things materializing as a cost, and where you can start seeing some sort of adjustment. That I think would be an extremely useful exercise. Starting from the previous example I was making, UK, Europe, identical. You see already a price differential here. Excellent. That's an adjustment. Now you move from a situation where you have a slightly different design. And I think it will be extremely useful, especially for those countries at the moment, thinking about implementing some sort of carbon pricing. So what is the type of design they should consider if truly the key motivation for designing such a system is mitigating any sort of complication due to CBAM.
Okay, Michael, any comments from you, any reaction from you? I gave you my 2 cents as to how I reacted, and again, I'm encouraging anybody wants to raise something on the from the participants. Just there's a little electronic hand. Just raise it, and then I will promote you to speaker. Is there anything from that you take back, Michael, on this?
Well, only maybe to buy time because there has been quite a lot of activity in the Q&A function. So there's a lot of questions there, but Andre is encouraging everybody to verbalize it in person. And we'll see. If that doesn't happen, we can still maybe go through those written questions. One thing, Luca, you've co-authored a lot of work with Baran Doda on linking of emissions trading systems in the past. And in a recent discussion, there was also the question, will CBAM incentivize more linking? Because that's exactly what Janan was mentioning. That's the full exemption. That's really what you want to have ideally if you want to reduce the impact of CBAM, is to have this full recognition, if you like, and then trade will flow just like it has in the past without this additional CBAM layer and the costs associated with that. But it's a very difficult question to answer whether indeed we would see more linking, because at the same time, if the EU then has this prospect that it no longer would apply the CBAM, it has to have great confidence that the emissions trading systems it links to are really robust and equivalent, and prices will converge. And we know that the CBAM is incentivizing carbon pricing systems in a number of economies that are structurally very different from the EU, where the average marginal abatement costs across the covered sectors are quite different from the EU. So it's kind of hard to imagine that you would see carbon prices that are at least somewhere similar to the EU, so that linking would be a more straightforward proposition without a very strong flow of money and allowances, vice versa, so to speak. I personally think that the CBAM may actually discourage linking, because the partners that will now emerge, in fact, will be so much less likely candidates for linking, despite what that prima facie incentive would be, you'd think, to have more linking in order to avoid the CBAM. It's an interesting question, but since Canan raised it, this Article 2.6, I think it was, that is, of course, something that many countries, I think, are hoping for down the road, to join essentially the European carbon market.
But I'm not beating down the door on the carbon market, but let me ask you this: so, is there a merit in considering that what you credit and that the 10 euros in India is not, or 100 euro, 10 euros in India it's how does it compare to 100 euros in Europe? I mean, can you really expect India to have 100 euros price of carbon? Is that the rational thing to have it, or do you have in some way to rationalize it, and that should enter into the conversation? Because I can interpret effective in many. I don't know. I would have to look again in the text. I'm not sure what effective is defined as, but we'll be interested. Canan, I don't know. I mean, and anybody wants to join in, because I see that I'm not having a lot of success, and this is why I hate these meetings, where I cannot have a lot of success getting people to react from the floor. Canan, go ahead, please.
Yes, and thank you, Andre and Michael. I don't think that there will be many volunteers to link to directly the EU system, because most of the emerging countries have a business as usual scenario, and they have a reduction from this business as usual scenario, intensity based or on total based. And this is national determined contributions are already prepared as per these conditions. And it really will put a price on the non-export production. And this should be calculated. But nobody cares for these technical issues and economical issues. The producers think, oh, we will be exempt. They just look at this issue, we will be exempt. That's the only target. But when these technical issues and economical issues are studied in detail, I think it will be more clear. There will be more clarification, because both Article 9 and Article 2.6 is not clearly defined. I think it's just put here to pass word veto.
Well,
to avoid double pricing. Maybe developed countries, maybe UK, Canada, USA, buy carbon clubs. They can consider connecting in the near future, because I think we believe that the European Union will not be the only country putting border adjustments. They declare it clearly. So all the export markets will be affected by that. But full linking, I don't know the conditions. I don't know what the European Commission wants from the developed countries, but I don't expect many volunteers when they consider this issue from all aspects.
There's a question in the chat from Aurora d'April, which asks about whether it is evident today. I mean, he says it's currently evident that the Commission intends to exclude the possibility of having a secondary market. It's quite clear there is no secondary market, because they're not tradable, and the regulation says that the legislation says so. There's no doubt about it. I mean, does it create a misalignment with the ETS carbon pricing? Of course it does, and frankly, from our side, we're not quite clear why it is the case. I'm not pretend to understand why it's the case. If you want to have something which is very similar, then you should have as a matter of fact, allow it to be working the same way. So that's why we are, as ERCST, will be looking at how hedging in the EUA market, where the only place, one of the places where you can hedge, will affect the market, because right now you have hedging for power. The power hedging is changing because of the changing of the nature of the energy matrix. Then you have the increasingly emerging hedging for industrials, and now you're going to have hedging for CBAM, which we're convinced will happen. Will not happen today, but it will happen. How is that going to work? Now, my prayer have been answered by Daniele Agostini, that have from Enel, that I have now promoted to as a speaker. And Daniele, thank you very much. Always there to save save the day.
I think more than your prayers, your provocations, you're challenging. I think most of the participants in the room are fascinated. Thank you for the very interesting exchange. However, there is an elephant in the room, and I think it was touched in passing by a couple of speakers for sure. Michael, when you're talking about, I think, the principle for common differentiated responsibility, and the elephant in the room is ambition. I mean, carbon leakage is, looking on one hand at, a level playing field, but another fact that the effort and the ambition is not necessarily level, and that's enshrined in that principle. So I feel, and I wanted to pose a question to the panelists. I mean, in some ways, the interpretation of most, I think, of the community, the carbon community, was that carbon price is more sort of an imperfect proxy for ambition. And so in that sense, it's a first step, which obviously the event today testifies it to it, is supposed to trigger a more substantial debate on how do you compare ambitions across geographies. So I was wondering, in your mind, should it be a first step to tackling that more ambitious challenge, or should it be interpreted? And I think it seemed to be the dominant view in the panel, just in terms of the legal nature of it. In that sense, we should just be looking at the ETS. But I mean, we all know that, and I think it came up, there is a lot of implicit carbon pricing, a lot of subsidies. I think, Andrea, you mentioned it, and they do play a role. And so to try not to go beyond that explicit carbon price seems to be, again, not addressing the core of the matter, what is truly keeping true ambition back. I'll leave it to that, and thank you very much for a very interesting debate.
Well, I'm what, I can't remember who's the last guy who did. I'm a coach player, so I'm a chair, but I will also, if I really am tempted, may also weigh in. But before I weigh in, I'm asking the panelists that are with Suzanne is gone, but Luca, Michael, and Janan, and Amanda, any of you, Sarah, any of you want to intervene on Daniele's? It was a little bit choppy for me. Maybe it is still the bad internet, but I understood that whether this is the end of the road, and whether the visible carbon price, ETS type price, is only the beginning, because in the end game has got to be the comparison of the level of effort in some way, recognizing other policies that may not be as clearly visible in price as the price that emerged from an ETS. And this is how I interpreted your question, Daniele, and whether this is going to go somewhere else and it's going to progress. And this is kind of the first act of the drama. Anybody wants to imagine?
I'm not going to imagine, but I think I'm going to support that view. I think it's going to be extremely difficult to associate to an explicit visible price a proxy for ambition, and that's what I was referring at the beginning. A price faced is not necessarily faced in the markets, not necessarily the price paid, effectively paid by the companies. So I think this will be putting more qualifications around what it means paid, effectively paid, I think is very important.
Anyone else?
If nobody else wants to weigh in, I'd like to see if Canan or Amanda have anything to add on this. It's a very difficult question. Not surprising coming from Daniele. I think, Daniele, from my perspective, I think that the questions of comparing level of effort, comparing ambition are inevitably going to become more and more relevant as we get closer and closer to the end game, because the stakes get higher. And if some are not pulling their weight, and however you define that, there's so many different ways to approach this, we're not going to get there. We're just not going to get there. In the end, in the second half of the century, everybody has to really be very, very, very serious about decarbonization. So we will keep coming back to these questions of comparing and looking. We've been so hesitant under the UNFCCC context. The stock take, is everything but pointing fingers, of course. I think eventually we're not going to be able to avoid it. And I think that already some of these trade-related measures are opening that discussion. And indeed, Andre mentioned earlier that when Canan was beginning her intervention that we're going to be in Ankara, this is one of the topics. What are the different approaches to trying to sort of compare, quantify, evaluate what different countries are doing? This is also what the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation approaches that the OECD is trying to steer is in the process of doing, but apparently meeting, unsurprisingly, a lot of resistance because you face these difficult, these controversial questions of ultimately maybe suggesting that some countries aren't doing what they should be doing. That said, I think for the CBAM and the immediate present, there was a very conscious decision to avoid any such morasses, slippery slopes of starting down debates where you can have so many different ways of approaching it. As Andre said, do you sort of correlate it with GDP or per capita or, some kind of justice corrective, etc. And I think it was Luca earlier mentioning, indeed, with a carbon price of, say, 100 euros, you would get tremendously different abatement results in some parts of the world than in others. In Japan, we're way past that already, whereas in all of sub-Saharan Africa, there's a huge world of abatement that could occur with such a price, but it would not be ethically, there's no case in which you could justify implementing it. It would wreck the economy. So the CBAM, I think, has steered clear of that, very consciously saying we're just going to look at the nominal carbon cost in a way, the price as a proxy for the cost, not for the effort, not for what the effort should be, just for the cost. And that's something we can mathematically credit, and we'll avoid anything beyond that. And even though I agree that there are scenarios where you feel like, well, is it fair? Is it in line with CBDR? Is it in line with the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined nature? Ultimately, I really don't see any practical alternative. So I've come to sort of understand this is a practical compromise, and that's what we have for now. But Daniele, I'm totally with you that we are seeing this debate coming. We're going to hit it. And I think in the US, you already have a lot more proponents saying, no, it's not about the policies. It's about whether they've decarbonized or not. It's about the carbon intensity. It's about the outcomes and not what they have in their books. So, it'll come sooner than later, I think.
Well, listen, I'll weigh in on this, Daniele. I think that this is the first act of the drama. Look, you're on the board of AIDA. I've been active in AIDA for a few years, and the dream was this global carbon price because it will deal with these issues of competitiveness and carbon leakage. That was kind of the dream. The dream hasn't happened, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that it's a nice dream, but it's probably the right dream, but may be difficult in part because of negotiation, the second part of because the equivalent price in different countries will end up, who knows where, and that may stir social unrest. But the CBAM is now taking the relay to deal with this. And the EU thought it was very, very cute, and they did the CBAM, and we solved the problem, or kind of solved the problem because we're so far ahead. The Americans retaliated, not retaliated, but reacted, whether in retaliation or because that was their choice for policy, was the IRA. And this is it may sound somewhat unconnected, if you want, on the face of it, but my belief is that there's a second shoe to drop, and that we are going to come to the table. I mean, these are band-aids. These are band-aids that we're getting even in these band-aids, Daniele, because we are not in 2012, we're 2023, and the caps and the difficulty and the amount of effort required is becoming increasing in many countries. The moment it's gonna continue to increase is people are gonna start really hurting. If you press enough, people are gonna hurt, and they're gonna force a solution that is a lot more a solution than this band-aid. Again, I'm not suggesting. I know that the EU put a lot of effort into it, but my belief is there's going to be another shoe, and it's going to be forced by the realities of the pressures that business is going to be facing in many parts of the world, and the society per total. I don't know. You heard a series of answers here. So, Amanda.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I wanted to mention. I totally agree with Danielle that ambition. It's the elephant in the room, and it's like in the end, it's one of the key, the main things that we want to get to like how to reach the goals as the whole world. Nevertheless, is one of as it is so complex, because we need to account, as Michael was saying, for just transition, the different but common responsibilities. It's one topic that keeps we keep letting it for the next. It's like a debate that needs to continue, but nevertheless we need not to forget that it's the end goal, that every country or every party in their own context keeps trying to implement more ambitious policies, so in the end we can get to the goal that we want to, or we can transition to the path that we want to move to for 2050. And yeah, that's what I wanted to mention.
Daniela, there is, I don't know if you remember, NL, where you are, has long-standing relationship with the World Bank in their carbon market programs, and there was a program, probably still alive somewhere in some format, in the World Bank called Network Carbon Markets. And Network Carbon Market actually was looking at quantifying the level of effort, and was proposing an exchange rate for the different currencies that they were emerging in different countries. I played, I'm being immodest, I played some role, and I like the concept. It was intellectually a very interesting concept, but politically explosive. Because you're gonna, somebody, and even if you farm it out to somebody else to make that assessment, let's say the bank doesn't do it, but it kind of creates the system, and somebody else makes that assessment, going and telling the I don't know, I won't say a country, like a big country that has an emission trading system, that the ton is not equal, or the unit that is, they say it's a ton, is not equivalent to a EUA. That's not a good, that politically, somebody's going to pick up the phone and make some nasty remarks. So I think that it's there. It's just, we don't have a crisis yet, or the crisis is brewing. At the moment you have a crisis, you never let it go to waste. I don't know. Luca, did you want to jump in?
No, that before was just a legacy hand.
Okay. Well then, all right. Anyone else that would like to have any remarks? Again, Daniela was the courageous one that kind of jumped in with the question, but I'm not seeing any other questions on the from the attendees. It is something that we intend to have also discussion at the COP. I think the reality, this is becoming real. this is becoming real. We're getting questions like this from many. We'll see how it comes, how it's going to become reality. But really, also the Commission has been doing quite a few of these events and webinars and videos, trying to elucidate things. The one that they can elucidate at this point, as you said, Luca and others, this is still emerging. There is no clarification. There is no act on this. So we will have to wait for that act. We hope, and we have reasonably good working relationship with those parts of the Commission that they lose it. We hope that they have taken notice of what we have written here. We hope that others will try to socialize as much as possible. I think there are a few things that Michael and Sarah, we may want to add in the paper based on what we're coming here. I don't think it requires fundamental surgery, but maybe adding a few things to think about. In the end, this paper is about kind of thinking through the process, and also kind of giving arguments to the people that make the legislation or the regulation, the act, how to think about it, and giving the arguments on what side for those that are politically engaged to make those decisions. We hope they will listen to these arguments, and others will make. If there is no other comment, I think that maybe that will close to close. Michael, any last thoughts from your side?
No, I've been typing some answers to the Q&A questions, but I agree. I think some of them are very straightforward clarifications. Some have been answered already in the course of the webinar, so I don't think we have to go back to them necessarily.
Very well. In that case, again, Janan and Amanda and Luca and Susanne somewhere in Jakarta, Michael and Sarah, especially Sarah, thank you very much to all of you for being here, for contributing to this. Believe me, the fun part for us is interacting with you and listening to you. We have a lot of fun arguing with each other. Which are made for some very long and interesting conversation. For those of you that know the personalities involved, you can imagine that it descends in a very heated and interesting debate. So again, I'm very grateful for having such great partners in doing this. So with this, we'll call it to a close, and we will, Michael, you want to introduce kind of the last kind of product for this year, for this CBAM.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
We even have code. That will be P4R4 for those who have followed carefully. So it's the fourth phase of the CBAM project at ERCSD, and the fourth report in this fourth phase, so we should kind of celebrate. It's almost like a round birthday, is going to deal with a topic that's going to rise in media attention in the next months, namely cooperation around well, especially the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum that the EU and the US were supposed to have negotiated by the end of this month, but it increasingly looks like those negotiations will be extended. So we'll comment on those negotiations and weigh in on some of the options going forward. We may also touch upon the G7 somewhat. So it's looking again more at the international level, and I think that's consistent with the previous phases where we always try to also keep our view beyond just the European context.
Well, thank you again, and we're in the process of setting our COP program, and unless we have trouble finding venue, which we don't think, because we hope we know enough delegation that will manage to wiggle a room from somebody. We certainly will have a discussion on the CBAM and some of the aspects, of the broader aspect, I think is generally known, but some of this kind of implementing acts that are coming together and that people are quite preoccupied, will try and deal with that. With this, again, thank you all very much, and have a nice rest of the day. We'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.